primary commodity export dependence is a key frame that we use in the Post-Colonialism Today project. It is something that, as a concept, is acknowledged and widely used all over. I mean, long before, in the immediate period, most scholars and political activists framed the issues and challenges of development in Africa, and in fact, the third world, through the fact that we are primary commodity dependent. In a certain sense, in fact, the establishment of UNCTAD, for instance, owes itself to the recognition that developing countries are not going to develop unless they confronted the challenge of what I call now primary commodity dependence. In the Post-Colonialism Today project, though, we try to deploy two specific arguments, which is important. One is that African governments in the immediate post-independent period recognized primary commodity dependence as a problem to be solved. And whatever their ideological position, whether they are Houphouët-Boigny in Ivory Coast, Senghor in Senegal, Kaunda in Zambia, and Nkrumah in Ghana, they all directed their efforts to try and overcome what they saw as the binding constraints for their development, which the structure of their economy as primary commodity exporters posed on them. And in our project, we are very keen that whatever they did, that's our lessons that we have to learn. And in fact, they may have formulated answers to the problem, which may not be totally successful, but even the recognition of that as a challenge, the question itself, is something that is important for us. So that's the first argument for the Post-Colonialism Today project. The corollary second thing is that by contrast to the immediate post-independent governments, the neoliberal structural adjustment period ignored primary commodity independence as a problem. In fact, they celebrated it. By this argument about the African countries should export their comparative advantage, they were basically saying that we should make a virtue of the fact that Ghana is a cocoa producing country, somebody is a mineral, so they just export to the world what your things were. And therefore, the fundamental constraints posed by PCED were not a central aspect of policy making in the neoliberal period. By ignoring it, they actually reinforced it. So it's only of late that you can see then after 30 years of reinforcing primary commodity dependence, of saying ignore it, or say just exploit it and use it for yourself. They are now beginning to say, okay, there's a problem. We have to do something about it. So the argument that PCT, the Post-Colonialism Today project, wants to make is that to the extent that early post-independent African government recognize a problem that to be solved, and to the extent that neoliberalism ignored it, we have two contrasting approaches that we can explore the contrast and benefit from to look at it. And so that is one of the central thing that has made peace primary commodity an important issue in the way we have organized our research and the things that we've done. Now, what is primary commodity export dependence really? In a certain sense, the first thing to note about it is that in the argument and the conception, it is just the ways in which prior to colonialism, countries in Africa or societies in Africa, which were economically, politically, and sociologically organized as organic units and driven by their internal concerns, so that they were meeting the economic challenges around the needs, around their own organic dynamics. Those economies were extroverted, destroyed, fragmented, and economies around their own dynamics were destroyed and transformed into economies which were looking outwards. A new structure was put in place so that African economies were now inserted in the global economic order as providers of resources for the development of other countries, other areas, for Imperial Europe, basically. Now, this structure basically therefore was a reconstruction, the destruction of what African countries had. So that by the end of colonialism, you had a political economy which was marked by two features. One was that the economies were subordinated the dynamics of considerations of other economies outside the region. So African countries who before colonialism were mining their own iron, making weapons out of it, making tools out of it to meet their own agricultural needs, were now basically just mining the iron to ship it out to Europe so that Europeans can make things out of for their own raw materials. African countries were mining gold. The gold now tended not to serve their need, but to serve into capital accumulation outside the continent. So that external extroversion is one of the key features of what we call primary commodity export dependence. But there's an internal dimension of it. Not only are African economies subjected to the outside, the relationships that hitherto existed in the different sectors of the economy among each other was also fragmented. So you have an external subordination and internal fragmentation of the economies. So rather than agriculture beginning a component part of industry as it was before colonialism, or as I said, iron ore was mined to provide instruments to help in agriculture. Well, if you took any of those different parts of the economy, if you call them sectors of the economy, you are not really meeting each other anymore. So agriculture was constructed specifically to produce agricultural raw materials to be exported to Europe. The mines were constructed specifically to generate minerals to be exported to Europe, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this itself has a number of effects. The first effect was the fact that it meant that, first of all the wealth that was generated or created in the African continent, whether through agricultural production or your minerals, because it was dominated by forces outside, the wealth that was created was then necessarily expropriated, externalized, accumulated outside our economies. So when we talk today about illicit financial flows, capital flows, those things take place because the structure of our economy is set up in a way so that the wealth that is generated is necessarily carted out. Partly also because the forces which dominated the production, transnational corporation, especially in the mineral sector, which invested in a way that they just basically, the returns of investment is almost seen as logically to be externalized. And we know that. But equally importantly, when you have part of the economies internally not speaking to each other, what you have is that the internal dynamics of the economy is shallow, is weak. In other words, farmers who can only sell their products to the external market don't necessarily develop an internal market for their products so that they can also expand their production. When you have to import everything that you produce, then you are not also importing basically only to serve the other sides of the economy. So the relationship between the economies is weak. Most of the time we talk in Africa and say we have small markets. Our markets are so small, there's nothing we can do about it. Now there's two dimensions of that. When different sectors of the economy don't talk to each other, basically it makes the economy small. So many Ghana, normally we kind of have the impression that it's because our populations are small. That is why our internal markets are not very big. It's not necessarily true. I mean, many African countries have populations which are bigger than the Netherlands and Denmark. But it's because of that, in the coherence of their economies, they're able to have a deeper internal domestic economy. But it's also because, whereas before colonialism, different parts of African societies interacted with each other. The border between Ghana and Togo was a society which interacted. Now we are kind of sheltered within artificial borders, etc. So essentially, when we are talking about primary commodity export dependent economy, we are talking basically summarily about the external subordination of our economies to external forces and the internal fragmentation. It is a relationship which means that the wealth that is generated is appropriated outside our economies. I think it's important to think about primary commodity export dependence as a relationship. Because normally when we talk about it, we think about the primary sector itself. We think about agriculture, we think about mining, and we tend to associate primary commodity export dependence simply with the sectors. Now that is true, I'll come and talk about one. But actually the relationship is more important. It's a relationship of appropriation of wealth, the extroversion of the economic dynamics, and the ways in which our economy don't talk to each other. If you think about it this way, then in fact, even economic sectors that we don't normally think of as primary commodity can be seen. So tourism, for instance. I mean, recently, TWB in Africa, we did some analysis. And if you look at the tourist sector in many African countries, whether tourism in Kenya or Tanzania, it exhibits the same relationship where the sector is dominated by 5 transnational tourist companies, which invest, appropriate their wealth, and Africans are left with little out of it. And that also has extended now to other areas, telecom, finance, everything. So it's a totality of the economy that we are talking about. Nevertheless, for the purposes of today's webinar, we are focusing on the natural resource sector just to, as a way of also illustrating just how colonial independent governments confronted this reality. Focusing on the natural resource sector is important also because even though I've just said that primary commodity export dependence is a relationship, the truth of the matter is that historically, that relationship was constructed much more virulently and concentrated through the mining sector. So if from all the way from South Africa to Zimbabwe, to Ghana, to Leopoldville, I mean, to all the other places, the process of colonization was consolidated as a process of when European companies supported by their governments exercised possession and ownership of our minerals, expropriated the locals, and began to construct it for themselves. So the classical relationship of primary commodity export dependence was demonstrated most of all in the relation that we developed with Europeans, European companies, European governments of our minerals and other natural resources. It was replicated later as more and more minerals were discovered, in addition to gold and diamond and coal, oil. Every time you have a new mineral or natural resource, the relationship is reconstructed out of it. Now, but before we look at just what African governments did, especially in the area of minerals to assert their sovereignty, it would be useful to say that in general, the immediate post-colonial governments, when they confronted this reality of primary commodity export dependence, they saw as their duty to revert that process in 2 ways. First of all, was to ensure that the economies of their countries now accumulated for themselves, what they call taking over the commanding height of the economy strategically, so that they can use the economics and wealth for their own countries. But more importantly, they also wanted to find ways in which whatever was being generated in the economy, the incoherence, the fragmentation that I talked about was reestablished. So that is why many other African countries talked about industrialization. The missing middle of our primary commodity export dependence, the fact that we exported everything and imported everything. What African countries thought they should do was actually to reconnect their capacity to produce, which they had before colonialism, which was now distorted. So industrialization as such was an important endeavor that almost every African country saw as important. It's not simply African countries, the world saw industrialization as an important element that you cannot do anything without. So the challenge that most African countries found was, how do you generate the resources to support industrialization? And in that sense, they saw, and that's what they saw the problem. They saw, for instance, the pre-existing exports that they had, agricultural export, mineral export, as a place that they can get the resource that they need to be able to support the factories that they were establishing, to establish, to fund the institutional mechanism that they were establishing, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at it very carefully, a number of things that African governments did in the immediate post-colonial period to assert their sovereignty over resources range over a number of areas. The first and foremost thing was to assert that this resource belonged to us. And if you go almost everywhere, Ghana, Tanzania, and co, the mineral wealth of the economies were vested in the state. So Ghana, for instance, the law which says that the mineral wealth, all the wealth under the soil, is vested in the Republic of Ghana and the president who holds the custodianship, for instance. That's an important fact. So it was, whereas in the olden days, you could say that some company came and said, we have a concession over this area, we own it. No, the wealth is ours, and then we can bargain with you about how to do with it. Now, in some other areas, extended us to nationalizing even the mineral mines that were constructed. So if you look at it very carefully, all across the African continent, from Zambia to Botswana to Ghana, there was a very attempt to nationalize mineral ownership, and even the mines that were constructed as an important element. Of course, nationalization by itself does not necessarily give you total control over processes, because as Zambia found out, they nationalized the mines, but the international mineral value chains, they couldn't control it. So even though they own the copper mines, the copper companies managed to undermine their capacity. So it teaches lessons about what you do to accept sovereignty. But beyond nationalization, they also put in many measures that allows them, for instance, even to get more. So taxation, the level of taxation and royalties that were implemented was an important element. What I found was interesting is that they went beyond the question of economics. So for instance, Kwame Nkrumah, in his attitude to minerals or the mines, was not simply talking about how much wealth am I going to generate from my mines and how does it support me. In fact, there was a letter that Nkrumah had an exchange with the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, in which he said that he, as Nkrumah, was going to buy off some loss-making British mineral mines which wanted to close. Now, of course, many people will be surprised when they hear Nkrumah trying to buy off loss-making British mines. But Nkrumah was asserting that he was going to buy the mines because for him to retain employment as a social act in the country was very important. So giving the mines open was not simply a profit motivation thing, but to make sure that there's employment going on as a social issue on the basis of which we can continue to expand opportunities for people. So there's even an even social dimension for asserting sovereignty by minerals. And then there is all the other things that they did, like insisting that there should be transfer of skills, transfer of technology, many attempts that they made to ensure that their use of the minerals in their case, they benefit a lot more from it. We could say, though, that one of the limitations that they had was that most of the African countries still continued the predominant approach to the mineral source to try and get as much wealth or the minerals as possible to satisfy a national agenda. So the later situation about how they can make sure that the mineral economy build better linkages within their economy was something that the early ones did not fully pay attention to. Other countries like Botswana paid more attention to that. So Botswana, for instance, was one of the mineral economy where in the post-independent period, it is insisted that the processing of minerals mined in Botswana must take place, or at least a substantial part of it must take place in Botswana. They also insisted on the need that procurement of inputs for mining must also be sourced from Botswana. These are the kind of modern day things that domestic processing and procurement we are looking at, which could have been a bit more explored in the early post-independence period. The unfortunate thing, though, is that even these attempts that the post-independent government were doing was something that once the World Bank and IMF got hold of the foreign policy in the 1980s, they put a stop to. Because, and this is something that will be explored, I imagine, tomorrow into more details. Because there's a World Bank policy document which made it clear to African governments on the structural adjustment that they must give up any kind of pretension to use minerals to serve national priorities or social priorities or developmental priorities. It just made it clear. And he said, hitherto, they should focus on how much money they can get. They should give up, they should return to the situation where they gave up the running and management of minerals and the mineral wealth to transnational companies, and then they should just see how much more revenue they can get about it. The paradox of it is that even the revenue that they're supposed to get out of it, the World Bank assured that for the purpose of attracting foreign investment, they have to lower taxation, lower royalties, and give many, many concessions and incentives to the mining companies so that by the structural adjustment period, the accession of sovereignty over natural resources that was started in the immediate colonial period as an attempt to try and address primary commodity export dependency was truncated. So that today, we ended up with this process where what was started under colonialism was reinforced, and that's what we have today to grapple with.